Did Jesus ever really claim to be God? The answer is yes. However, in our Western English mindset, we actually expect people to speak a certain way. Just come out and say a black and white statement. Say what you mean what you say. And when our leaders, politicians, religious elite start to use metaphor or euphemism, or it seems like they're skirting around the answer to give us this vague response, we think they're being shady, misrepresenting the truth, or actually deceiving us in some way. But this perspective actually does us a disservice when we approach the Greek and Hebrew, because these ancient languages are actually rich with meaning and depth and color. And to translate them into just one or two words might actually hinder us from understanding what's actually being said. In that culture, the way the language was used was understood very differently than we might understand a euphemism or a metaphor, or words that might seem elusive to us today. You see, throughout the New Testament, there are heaps and piles of scriptures where Jesus is using Old Testament language to identify who he is. But we want him in English to just say, "That's it. I am the God, creator of the universe. I have been around since eternity." But that's not the culture in which he lived. That wasn't the way people used the language back then. But there's one way that Jesus identifies himself that is the final straw and actually gets himself killed. And this is going to be a little bit tricky for us. And I'm going to unpack some things that some scholars and doctors have really kind of laid out in a high-level theology. And if you want to check my sources, the links are in the description below. Be sure to check them out. But I'm just going to dumb Christian this. You see, in the Old Testament, before Jesus shows up on the scene, the ancient Jewish Israelite way of thinking about and worshiping God, they believed that there were two powers in heaven, two Yahwehs, if you will, one God in two people. In the New Testament, we see three people, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But in the Old Testament, they had these two pictures. One, God Yahweh in spirit, and one God Yahweh in the form of a son of man. Not that they were two separate gods, but they were one being in two persons, but the same power and the same mission and purpose of their existence to be one God. We see throughout the Old Testament, when God is spirit, he created, right? His spirit hovered over the waters. We see the Spirit of God coming upon people. And we also see God appearing as a person to Abraham and others throughout the Old Testament. But the big one that kind of like drives home this point that God is in heaven as two beings, the two powers in heaven, is in Daniel chapter 7. Go read it for yourself. I'm just going to give you a summary. But the first part of Daniel chapter 7 is Daniel looking into heaven and seeing that there is this Ancient of Days, this spirit version of God. And he goes on to declare, oh, this is what God is like. This is who he is. And then he takes a break to talk about some other things that are going on. And then he says, "And I saw coming on the clouds one like the Son of Man, who was given the same authority, the same power, the same mission, the same purpose as the Ancient of Days." This second person of God is very different from the first, and yet he is the same being. One aspect of this God is that he's ethereal, that he's spirit, and that he is the Ancient of Days. He pre-exists matter. And then there's this quality of God that appears as a son of man. He appears as a person. Now, this type of theology, this belief system was done away with after Jesus shows up on the scene, because they need to come up with a system that undermines the idea entirely that God can become a man. And yet, it is littered throughout their Bible, the Tanakh, the Christian Old Testament, where it boldly declares this is who God is, preparing them for the Christ, God in flesh as a man. And when Jesus is on trial, because they are trying to get rid of him, they hate what he's doing in the community. And one of the Pharisees stands up and they say, "I command you, tell us, are you the Son of God?" And Jesus says, "Let me tell you about who I am. the Son of Man coming on the clouds. And he quotes this Daniel chapter 7, where it identifies that the second person of God, the Son of Man, is who he is. And this is outrageous to the Israelites, to the Jewish people, because it is a bold declaration that I am Yahweh. I am one of those two powers that you worship from the Old Testament. That's who I am. They lose their shit and they go on tilt and they say, you've heard it from his own mouth. He is blaspheming because he is claiming to be God. This is the beauty of the subtext in the ancient culture and the ancient language, that even when we don't quite understand because he's not speaking in an American language or a culture that we're familiar with, this is Jesus the Christ boldly and explicitly declaring, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Moses. I am Yahweh. I love you guys. I'll catch you later.